Welcome to the study guide answers for the 10th video in this Genesis Bible study series. These answers will be covering Genesis chapters 42 through 50. Jacob appears to have repeated his past error, and Benjamin is now the preferred child. What could explain Jacob's persistent conduct? Mostly that Benjamin is the last left of his favorite family, meaning his wife died. Joseph is, in his eyes, dead. So there's just Benjamin left of his preferred family. And so he's favoring him. And really, in those times, it does seem like favoritism wasn't frowned on as much as it is now. So it probably wasn't as big of a deal as we would think of it as being today. Did Benjamin receive the same hatred from his older brothers as Joseph did? From the text, the answer would be no. It doesn't seem like he received the same amount of hatred as Joseph did. Benjamin receives better treatment than Joseph did from his brothers. What's their motivation for acting like this? There could be two main reasons they're treating Benjamin better. One could be that they learned from their past mistakes and realized that they went a bit too far in how they dealt with Joseph. And they could have seen how it affected their father so much, and they're having some guilt behind it and decided not to treat Benjamin that way. But it also could be that maybe Joseph was much more arrogant and flaunted the fact that he was his father's favorite, and maybe Benjamin doesn't do that. The absence of jealousy towards Benjamin may have resulted in the brothers leading a more contented life. How so? By not focusing on something they can't control, which is their dad's love for their brother more than them, they were able to be more contented in that they didn't dwell on something they couldn't really control or do anything about. And we see people doing that all the time. Anxiety is at an all-time high in our society because people tend to dwell on things. And if it's something that you can't control, why dwell on it? There's nothing you can do about it. So just deal with it and get on with your life. And by Benjamin's brothers probably doing that, they were able to be more content and probably were able to treat Benjamin better. Reuben gave the impression that he wanted to spare Joseph's life, but his actual motive was to avoid a bloody scene. What causes people to recall the past in a positive light? Well, Reuben, having been the eldest, was responsible for Joseph, so his wanting to avoid a bloody scene, yeah, the motive for it was probably just to make his life a little bit better, in that he could have been held responsible if Joseph died, and maybe he was held responsible. But why he's kind of remembering this in a different light, or a more positive light, is just that I think our human nature makes us remember the past better than it actually was. You hear people all the time say, oh, back in the good old days, and you even see that on TV shows in the 1950s, they say the same thing. So it's like, well, it can't always have been better in the past. So we just tend to remember the highlights of our life, which will be good things that happen to us. Maybe some people can do the opposite as well, just remembering bad things. But we tend to forget the mundane things and just remember the good or the bad. And then through rationalizing things we did in the past, we sometimes make it better than it was, just so we don't dwell on it and think that we were bad in it. So Reuben here is probably remembering it to make himself seem more positive, so that when he looks back on it, he doesn't have to feel so bad about it. Who is typically blamed for natural disasters? Since it says who and not what, the answer would be God. And you do see that a lot of times people will blame God when there are things like hurricanes, tornadoes, or in this case, famines. Can experiencing a natural disaster that affects you cause you to question your faith? Yes, because people who have a strong faith life, a lot of times will feel like that they're immune to bad things like this happening to them. And one could understand why, because if you feel like you have that close relationship with God, you would think that He wouldn't allow things like this to happen. Because something like that is an evil act. And you just have to remember that God does sometimes allow bad things to happen so that at the end something good comes from it. So maybe, yes, a natural disaster happens, but something good will eventually come from that. Now, unfortunately, it might not be really obvious what that good is, or it could even be a good that happens many, many years later that stemmed from that. And that's where it's difficult because we don't see the full picture. Only God can see that. So sometimes it's difficult to understand when something bad happens that there is a good that will eventually one day come out of that. In what way can faith-based beliefs aid in managing natural disasters? Praying as a group, if you know like a hurricane's coming or something, yeah, that's powerful, and you never know, it could have an effect, and maybe your town will be spared or whatever, your house or whatever. There are examples of that throughout history of people who've prayed and then like disasters have missed houses and things like that. So things like that do happen, but assuming that's not going to happen, just having faith-based beliefs helps you to come to grips with something if something bad happens. And I think that's important because then it'll help you deal with it a little bit more appropriately. Why do certain individuals ignore an impending natural disaster? Two reasons. One, if you want to think of it in a faith-based way, maybe they think, like I said, they're going to be immune to something bad happening to them. But God doesn't always do that. If I say, well, here, let me jump off this 100-foot tall building because I have a strong faith and God won't allow anything bad to happen to me, well, God doesn't protect stupid. And that would be something stupid that I was doing. So maybe some people just think that they're immune to these sort of things because of their faith. But secondly, I also think as humans, we tend to want to think that something bad won't happen to us in general. So there can be denial of maybe even that there is a natural disaster coming, or you don't think far enough ahead to what the repercussions can be for you. Although prayer can help during natural disasters, why is it still crucial to take other safety measures? Mainly for kind of the reasons I've already been talking about. Like, we still have to take care of ourselves. So yes, God can help guide us. God can help us, but it's still on us to take the steps necessary. It's like if I just sit around all day and I don't go make money, money's just not going to be given to me by God. So God doesn't work that way. You have to do things for yourself. And it would be the same thing with a natural disaster. It's important for you to, if it's a hurricane, go get water, maybe board up your windows, do all those kind of things to help yourself. And praying is beneficial, but it's not going to stop something bad from happening if you don't take the precautions that you should. Why did Joseph put the silver cup in Benjamin's sack? Mainly to test his brothers. The last time he'd seen his brothers, they did something bad to him, so he can't really trust them now Yes, there's been many years since that event, but we all know people in our life who, yes, they were kind of that way when they were younger, deceptive or whatnot, and are still that way today. So I think Joseph was mainly testing him. Now, putting the silver cup in there could have been a bit of a dig on the fact that he knew that he was sold for silver himself. In this verse, what is the irony of Judah's statement? The irony is that basically one of the main things that got Joseph in trouble was his dream, where he said that his brothers were going to bow down to him. And now we're seeing here in this verse, Judah basically saying that he is a servant to Joseph. So Joseph's dream came true. And that's what's ironic of what Judah said, even though Judah couldn't know the irony yet because he doesn't know Joseph is still alive and the person that he's talking to is his brother. Judah offers himself to Joseph in place of Benjamin. Why did he do this? It could be that Judah did it because he bears responsibility for Benjamin. He told his father that he would look after Benjamin. But it also could just be that Judah actually has compassion for Benjamin, loves Benjamin. And anyone who's in that situation, a lot of times you'd replace yourself for them. So Judah could be doing that here. And he knows too that his father loves Benjamin and favors Benjamin and how much it would hurt him if Benjamin wasn't back with him. So he could have been doing it for that reason as well. Why did Judah treat his father's new favorite son Benjamin better than he treated Joseph? I'd like to believe that he learned from his past mistake. And by treating Benjamin better, it actually made his life better. Because he doesn't hold that grudge and doesn't have that hatred in him that he had towards Joseph. If you're carrying around a hatred in you, it just makes you more miserable. So hopefully Judah just learned from his past mistake. What is suggested about God's plan for Joseph by his progression from favored son to slave, then prisoner, and ultimately the second most powerful man in Egypt? What it says is that God always has a plan. And we might not always know what the plan is, or it might not seem like it would be what we would want, or even we might think of it as evil or something bad that's happening. And that definitely happened to Joseph here, because he ends up becoming a slave, then he's imprisoned. But at the end, something good did end up happening. So here's just a great example of, we were talking about it with natural disasters, of God allowing evil to happen, and God really allowed this evil to happen of Joseph becoming a slave, but of something good coming from it. And there's no way Joseph could have known what was going to happen to him and that something good would come from it. But the thing with Joseph is he always seems to have had faith in God, even when he was going through these bad experiences. And I think that helped him to get to where he got. How does this apply to you? I think it's important to just keep in mind that you should always have a positive attitude, always believe and have faith in God, that no matter what you're going through, if it's a hardship or even a good thing, to always keep God at the focus of your life. And always remember that He is ultimately looking out for you. What can we learn from Joseph's story? I would say the number one thing that we can learn from this is just that God always does make something good come from evil. And this is just a story that points that out. Yes, it's a simple story in some ways, but it's a perfect one to point that out. So when there's more complex evil, in the world or in your life, always keep in mind that God will eventually make a good come from it. Name a few other instances in history where God brought good despite evil. I can think of two really good ones from the New Testament. One, of course, is the crucifixion of Jesus, in that by his death, we all end up having eternal life, and that his sacrifice was the ultimate sacrifice, and all our sins are forgiven because of his sacrifice. And then also just look at St. Paul, who was a witness to Stephen's martyrdom, and he himself had killed many Christians, and he ended up becoming maybe the greatest evangelist in the history of Christianity. Have you ever experienced a setback that turned out to be a blessing in disguise? I think everyone has done that, some adverse situation, and by having a positive attitude, you can make something good out of it. Like for me, I remember as a kid, I was on the baseball team, but I wasn't any good. I didn't even get a play. But instead of dwelling on that in a negative light, it really made me try harder. And so I ended up becoming a really good baseball player. But more than anything, it just gave me a good drive and determination, so that later on, when I switched to a different sport like tennis, I ended up becoming great at that because I had a good work ethic from training for baseball, and that carried over into tennis. And then for 20 years of my life, I ended up being a tennis coach. So by me having a setback in baseball and not playing, instead of just quitting, I ended up trying harder, and then that helped me later in life to forge a career for a time in my life. What was your approach to handling this situation? I kind of already mentioned it, but it's worth pointing out again. It's just staying positive and not quitting. And other examples of times where I've had like a setback or whatever, at that time, not so much, because as a little kid, I didn't think about it as much. But now I definitely use more praying and being open to God and his will, if it's other, even little setbacks or just anything. So initially, stay positive, but also open yourself up to more prayer, become closer to God. That's something that helps in a difficult situation. So you can turn that negative into positive by growing your relationship with God. What was the significance of God's last conversation with Jacob? He passes down or reiterates the universal blessing to Jacob again, but then really it's going to be a long time before God talks to another Israelite. How long until another Israelite hears from God? The next one to hear from God's going to be Moses, and it will be over 400 years from the time Jacob last talked to God. Would you like it if God still communicated with people like he did in the Bible? Why or why not? Well, in a lot of ways he still does. He can still communicate, I think, with people through dreams, or he can talk quietly to people in their heads. Maybe he doesn't manifest himself to the degree that he did in the Old Testament or even the New Testament with Jesus, but God still does communicate. Maybe it would be nice if there were more physical manifestations of God communicating, but then again, would people actually believe it? I find it hard to believe that they would. I really think if God took all the stars in the sky and wrote in the sky, I am God, I am real, you would still get people to deny that, say, well, it's just an illusion. So God knows what he's doing, so he communicates with us currently in the ways that's best suited for his message to get across to us. Why do Egyptians view every shepherd as an abomination? Probably because they didn't eat sheep, and most other Middle Eastern cultures did eat sheep. So he probably thought it for that reason, although it could also have been that maybe the other cultures were encroaching on Egyptian land and stuff, so they didn't like them for that reason. But I think it has more to do with the fact that Egyptians didn't eat the sheep. In the Bible, it is common to read about people moving to new places. Have you ever moved to a new place? If so, why did you move? Yes, I've moved before. Sometimes it's simply because you want to move to a nicer house. Other times, if it's moving like out of state, it can be for reasons like maybe there's better job opportunities, maybe you like the weather, things like that. So there's a multitude of reasons why people move. For me, I've done it for all those reasons in the past. What was easy about it and what was difficult? I don't know if there's really anything easy about moving, maybe the thinking about it. But other than that, it's actually pretty difficult. I mean, if you got a bunch of stuff, you gotta pack it all up. You gotta move it to a new house. You might have to sell your old house before you can move into the new one. So in a lot of ways, moving is a hassle, which is probably why some people don't really move that often. What long-term effects will Joseph and his family's time in Egypt have? Obviously, they'll end up becoming more like Egyptians, which is one reason why Joseph might have wanted his family to stay in Goshen, which would have been more on the outskirts. Maybe they weren't in that area so indoctrinated into Egyptian society. But long-term effect is that the Israelites become slaves of the Egyptians. Joseph's actions during the famine can be seen as heroic for safely guiding the Egyptians, but also villainous for enslaving them. What is your opinion and why? I can see both sides of the coin in that it does seem like that he's taking advantage of the situation by eventually enslaving the people. But one thing to keep in mind is that maybe the Egyptian culture at the time wasn't really about charity, and the people might not have accepted the grain without giving something back. And so originally it was the money, then their livestock, then their land, and then eventually themselves. And one other thing to keep in mind too, slavery isn't always as bad as we think it is. It could have been mutually advantageous for these people then to be slaves in that, yes, they're still at least alive, right? But also, a lot of times slaves in those situations were actually treated decently. So it wasn't like they were getting whipped and abused like we read about what happened with the slaves in America. So it could have been kind of a mutually advantageous situation and not so bad as it was here in America. Joseph accepted the Egyptians' offer to become slaves, but was it moral to enslave them over such a small thing as seed? I would say it wasn't a small thing. First off, seed, grain, that was everything in life. So it was actually a big thing. And secondly, kind of the key word here is the Egyptians even offered themselves up as slaves. So it was most likely that they wanted it to. So I would say it probably was moral for those times to accepted the offer. It wouldn't be today, but it was then. What's your opinion on how Jesus would view Joseph's actions? I think Jesus would have viewed Joseph's actions a little bit unfavorably. And I can say this just based off of the fact that it seems like early Christian times, it was everyone gave everything they had to everyone. And we see that in the Acts of the Apostles, where people end up selling all they have and giving it to the church and the community, and then they live off it together. So I think Jesus would have felt that Joseph should have just given the grain, and then everyone could have just lived together, but it should have just been given instead of bartered for. In this verse, the usage of the name Israel is different. How is it used differently? Here it's used to mean not just Jacob, but all the Israelite people. And it's kind of setting the stage for Exodus chapter 1, where the Israelite people become so numerous that they become a threat to the Egyptian people. Is this verse fulfilling God's covenant with Abraham and Isaac? No, I'd say it's not completely fulfilling it. The people are starting to multiply, the Israelite people, but that's about it. The other elements of the covenantal promise are not being fulfilled yet. What led to Reuben and Simeon's disqualification from the firstborn's blessing? Well, Reuben slept with Bilhah, who was Jacob's wife. Most likely Jacob saw that as Reuben trying to take over the family from Jacob, so that disqualified him. And then Simeon and his brother Levi, what they did at Shechem with killing all those innocent people, led to his being disqualified, as well as Levi being disqualified. Who took their place? Judah, being the fourth born, ended up getting the firstborn blessing. And him and Joseph end up with the longest blessings of all the 12 sons. What is the reason behind Israel giving a greater blessing to Ephraim, the younger son of Joseph? Israel knew that the tribe of Ephraim would end up being greater than the tribe of Manasseh. So it's just how God works. God didn't care so much about the firstborn element of things. That was more a cultural thing. And Israel knew that Ephraim would be greater, so that's why he gave him the greater blessing. There are many instances in the Bible where fathers bless their children. What blessings do you wish to share with your loved ones? Most importantly, just health, and also the ability to know and love God to their fullest. And I think that's a good blessing to give to anyone. It doesn't even have to just be family. We're meant as human beings to know and love God. That's really what our purpose is. So I don't think most people know that or do that. So that would be the biggest blessing I would like to give, and I'd pass that on to anyone, not just family. What are the reasons for the decreased importance of firstborn children? As a society, we've kind of gone away from favoritism. So I think that's it more than anything. And we still see it in certain elements of culture today. Like kings, usually the firstborn ends up becoming the king, right? So there's still elements of it, but that even dates way back to more ancient times. I'd just say it's because, like I said, we try not to favor children anymore. In what ways did God's perspective on firstborns contrast with the societal norms of the Old Testament? Well, it seems God was more about merit than birth order, as God frequently goes against the firstborn rule. So that seemed to be more of a societal thing and not a godly thing. So God's going to do what God's not only got to do, but what God wants to do. As his father's death approached, Joseph rushed to his side. Even now, this is a common occurrence. Why do people hurry to the deathbed of someone? I think just to get some sort of closure, maybe to see someone for a last time while they're still alive. It's, I think, just comforting not only for the people going, but also for the person dying. I think people want someone who's dying to be around and surrounded by people they love, as that gives them comfort in their last minutes of life. What causes people to feel sadness when they cannot say a last farewell? Probably just that it's always good to see someone for one last time, especially if you know it's going to be the last time you see them. And maybe you can say, I love you for one last time. People in history often remember the last words of a person. Why are a person's last words important to others? I don't really know the right answer to this. I guess I find it more fascinating than anything else that people like to remember the last words of someone. And maybe it's just that the last words are the last thing they said. This is the last thing to hold on to of someone, a tangible thing to hold on to, which is the last thing they said. But this is always something that has always intrigued me as to why we like to know those things. In what ways are the blessings given to Judah and Joseph different from the others? The main difference is that they're longer and more detailed than the other blessings. The verse suggests that a leader with powerful and worldwide influence who comes from the lineage of Judah will emerge. Who do you think this person is? This is a prophecy for Jesus. Ultimately, when will this prophecy be fulfilled? Well, it'll be fulfilled about 1700 years in the future when Jesus is born. The phrase, he shall wash his robe in wine and his garments in the blood of the grape, refers to what? This is referring to Jesus' flesh and also to his disciples. And this is just saying that Jesus will be sacrificed, and through his sacrifice, the sacraments will come about, which will end up eventually healing everyone. Does the blood of the grapes have any connection with the Eucharist? If so, what is the connection? Yes, quite simply that in the Eucharist, wine, which is made from grapes, is transfigured into Jesus' actual blood. Why do we hold funerals? We mainly hold funerals to say goodbye to someone who died, and really to, in a way, mourn but also celebrate that person's life, and to gather together as a group of people. And by gathering together and mourning together, it's easier for people to come to grips with what happened and kind of as a group say your final goodbye to this person. Does a funeral involve more than just a burial? I think I covered this pretty well on the last question, but yes, it involves a lot more than just a burial. That's just one element of it. But there's a lot more to it, such as people gathering together to mourn, to grieve, but then also to celebrate the life of the deceased. What is a lamentation? Well, lamentation means to lament, which means to grieve or to have sorrow for something or someone or for some occasion. When someone experiences a death, what do you think causes their grief? Just that they aren't going to see this person ever again, that the relationship and bond that they had with this person has now been severed, hopefully only temporarily, but still the fact that they won't be able to talk with this person or just be around them anymore, I think is why people grieve. The brothers of Joseph are concerned after their father's death. Are they more concerned about Joseph's ability to punish him? Or do they sincerely regret their actions and seek forgiveness? I think both are probably a little bit true here. I think they're worried now that their father is dead that Joseph is going to punish them, that maybe he held off punishing them out of respect for their father and knowing that it would have caused grief to their father if he had. But I also think that they do regret their actions. And they have asked for forgiveness, and I think Joseph did a good job of forgiving them, but for some reason the brothers just aren't really believing that they're forgiven. And really, that is the root of that is pride. It's like if somebody has forgiven you and you can't believe that they forgave you, then that's you being arrogant and prideful, thinking that you're not worthy of being forgiven. And people even do that with God and some things they do, things in their past, some really bad things they've done. If you've gone to confession, your sins have been forgiven, then you can move past that because it really is forgiven. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't maybe still realize that what you did is bad, because you can learn from that, but that doesn't mean you should dwell on it. Once something's been forgiven, it's forgiven, and if you can't let go of that, that's more pride on your part than anything else. What made them unconcerned about Joseph retaliating prior to their father's death? Well, who says they weren't unconcerned? Maybe they were concerned, right? But I would say that, like I already mentioned in the last slide, it probably is just more that they figured out that Joseph wouldn't harm them while their father was alive, because it would cause grief to their father, and Joseph wouldn't have wanted to cause him any more grief. Should Joseph's brothers be praised for indirectly making him wealthy and influential? Well, no, obviously, because doing something evil, if something good comes out of it, doesn't mean that your intent, which was bad, should be praised because something good came out of it. If anything, God is the one who should be praised and not Joseph's brothers. Does the end ever justify the means? I would say yes, if the end was good and how you got to that end was done through good, then yes. But if you're saying doing something evil and then something good comes out of it, that justifies it. For us as mere humans, the answer would be no, the ends don't justify the means. But for God, it's completely different. A lot of times when we do something evil, the intent is for something evil to happen from it. So if something good comes out of it, the end isn't justified by those means. And with God, though, it's different because he sees everything. And he's just using the evil done by others to make good come from it. So God isn't the one committing these evil acts, but he's making a good come from it. Whereas for us, we're the ones committing an evil act. And if we commit an evil act, we can't do that even if we expect something good to come out of it. So the ends don't justify the means if what got the ends was an evil act. But if it was a good act, then that's fine. Why do you think Joseph so wholeheartedly forgave his brothers? Joseph realized that these evil things that were done to him were being done for God's providence to come through. And he saw that because of all that happened, he was able to save not only all of Egypt, but also all of his family, and in a way, all the Israelite people. That still doesn't mean that the brothers should have done this, but Joseph at least understood that their evil acts, even though they're the ones that did them, were done so that God could make something good come from it. Now, that doesn't mean he would have just wholeheartedly forgiven him, because they still did do something evil to him. But because he is a very godly person, I think he understood that for his betterment, it was good to just forgive them. So then he could move on with his life, and they could move on with their life. When was Joseph's request to carry his bones out of Egypt fulfilled? Not till the Exodus, which happens over 400 years after his death. Joseph says God will visit his brothers. Has God ever visited you? Yes, and everyone else who's ever gone to a Catholic Mass has been visited by God himself, in that during the Eucharist celebration, the bread and wine become the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus. So at every single Mass, you are visited by God. In what ways does God visit people today? Well, if you ever go to adoration, God will be right there. And that is another way that God visits people today. And the Holy Spirit is all throughout everything and everyone. So God is constantly visiting people all the time, even if they don't acknowledge it. God is always around. His presence can be felt in everyone and everything. Where and when do you experience God's presence the most? Well, right at that Eucharistic celebration, I really can sense God's presence. But then also just quietly at home, if I'm sitting there praying, quietly in a room, when there's silence, I tend to experience God's presence more in those more quiet moments. And I think it's very important to have moments where you are in quiet and not looking at your phone or have on the TV. We've become a society now where it's just noise all the time. And I think it's very important to have those moments just to be quiet. And that's when you can hear God and feel his presence more. And that's it for the study guide answers for this 10th video. I hope that the whole study guide was beneficial and you were able to see how the stories in Genesis really do relate to today's times, and also how much of the Catholic faith is intertwined with what happened in Genesis. Thank you for watching all the videos, and I look forward to other Bible studies in the near future. Thank you again.